So, good evening to everyone. Boa noite a todos. Este vai ser meia hora de bom ambiente diferente do habitual, não apenas porque vai ser uma hora, mas também porque vai ser em inglês, sobre um tema absolutamente pertinente, que é a Presidência Portuguesa da União Europeia, que começa agora em janeiro e se estende até junho, e vamos, portanto, falar sobre as questões ambientais relativas a essa mesma presidência. E, portanto, sejam bem-vindos e desde já obrigado por participarem nesta discussão. Vamos ter connosco diferentes convidados e eu vou passar desde já para o inglês. So this was just a small introduction in Portuguese. Good evening, Patrick from the European Environmental Bureau, an European federation where Zero is also a member. Welcome also Jean-Marc from Zero Waste Europe. We're also a member of Zero Waste Europe. And Marc-Olivier Herman, he's from Oxfam, and we are actually engaged in a project with Oxfam in the area of climate change, and we'll have the opportunity here to talk for almost 1 hour. An important thing is for you in the audience, if you want to have any questions or any participation, you can do it through our Facebook. You just write the question as a comment, and I will pass it on to our guests tonight during the discussion. So just to repeat this in Portuguese, I think you probably understood it in English, but portanto, qualquer questão, basta porem nos comentários, na secção de comentários do Facebook, da Zero, onde estão provavelmente a assistir, e poderão, e nós passaremos essas questões durante o debate. Okay, so the first question to you is actually based on the topic that we decided to choose for this discussion. How can a presidency, during 6 months, shape the future of Europe, at least in what concerns the environmental issues during this next 6 months? Patrick.
Okay. No, thanks very much, Francisco, for that question, also for inviting me. And thank you for doing it in English. I think everyone will be very pleased that I don't try to speak Portuguese, because I would ruin your language. So what can Portugal do? What can a presidency do in 6 months? I mean, there's a rotation of member states. Each have 6 months to take the helm. And what they do is basically work through a series of key priorities that are on the agenda. Some of these they will have inherited from the German presidency, which is the one before, others which are just on the work program because things flow. Others are due to international context. For example, under the Portuguese presidency, you have the climate COP, you have the biodiversity COP, you've got the Mercury Convention discussions. When it comes to the first issue of what they can do is there will be a series of laws passed and discussed, strategies passed and discussed, for example, the chemical strategy. There'll be a mobility package. And what a country like what the presidency does is bring together all the member states to talk around what can we do to address it? How do we respond to, for example, the Commission proposal? Do we want to strengthen it? And so on and so forth. So, and at the end, they have two main meetings of the environment ministers, as well as an informal one, and they try to come up with called council conclusions to say, we think this is important. So, for example, we commit to a reduction of minus 55 percent greenhouse gas reductions. We support a biodiversity strategy that's ambitious and things like that. And that is really important. Normally, the countries play what's called a neutral role, in that they try to balance the interests of the different countries across Europe, like a neutral broker. But they can also make a big difference in terms of leading by example. So because there's the conviction communicates strongly by leading by example. So just very quickly, one thing, under the Finnish presidency, the Finnish ministers, Finland committed to go carbon neutral. And then the debate happened in Europe about carbon neutrality. So their position to encourage other member states was strengthened by their commitment. And similarly, of course, Portugal, in committing to different things, can also strengthen the position and strengthen the likelihood of agreement. But I'll stop it there. Yeah.
Mark or Jean-Marc, can you? How far do you think the Portuguese presidency can make a difference in the green politics in Europe during the next 6 months? Just a first and general comment. We'll go to the specific issues in a moment.
Yeah. Hi. Good evening, and thanks a lot to Zero for inviting Oxfam to join this debate, and good evening to everyone in Portugal. But maybe just a general comment on the role of a presidency, because the EU is a complex body, and so you should not underestimate or overestimate the role and the power of a presidency. First of all, it's one presidency among several, right? There's the presidency of the European Council, so the heads of states and governments. That's not what the Portuguese government is presiding. We're talking about the Council of the EU, so it's the ministerial body, the legislative body that makes the legislation and decides on the policies. And actually, it's first and foremost, it's a mediating role, it's a facilitating role. And so a presidency is supposed to step back from its national interests during the presidency. At the same time, it's a really, really important role because the presidency has the power of the agenda. So it sets the priorities in the work of the council and can decide whether the council will dedicate a lot of time or little time to a specific file. And it also is very important because the presidency brokers the compromises, and so it can set the level of ambition. So a presidency that wants to, is in favor of ambitious results will fight very hard and not compromise easily. Whereas a presidency that, just wants to get something can very quickly water down a file. So it is a very powerful role, but it's a limited role at the same time.
Jean-Marc, you're the last one on this general comment for now.
Yes. Hello, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. I would just add that if really Portugal wants to look into the future, adding to what has been said, if you zoom out to the kind of history of the European Union, I mean, where we are right now, if you leave aside the pandemic, which is impossible to leave out, is the fact that we are building the capacity of the Union to go into debt and to raise its own resources. That means also moving away from national contributions. We're still far from there. But it means that after having the common monetary policy and the euro, now for the first time we have European taxes. We have and how that relates to the environment is that the first kind of European tax has been the levy on the plastic that is not recycled at the national level. I think that is going to be marginal, but is symbolic, because for the future, this mediator and agenda setting role that the Portuguese presidency could play is actually to really take seriously taxation when it comes to carbon, when it comes to corporate, when it comes to web services and things like this, to build the power for the future to actually pay back all these, not only the debts, but actually the investment that we need in the coming years to actually move to the green transition. The money on the table today is enormous, but it's not enough. And I think that if we want to be visionary about the future, the Portuguese should actually start putting this in the agenda.
I would actually, I would like to start with that topic. You know, we're basically in the moment where the green transition, the European Green Deal will be, you know, absolutely decisive under the Corona crisis and we hope the post-Corona crisis. And of course, there are a lot of opportunities, but there are also some doubts about how the money will be used in you know, corresponding to the integrity that we want to follow the different topics in terms of sustainable development, climate change, the energy transition, the just transition, and so how do you think that the Portuguese presidency and you know, we hear here in Portugal that we are the first to actually try to finish everything related with the recovery package, such that we can implement the actions in the field. How do you think that this may distract or it may actually change the main transformation that comes from the European Green Deal and the Just Transition Fund and all the you know, this green movement from the Commission that started in December, and then the Corona crisis kind of threatened afterwards? Patrick.
Okay, yeah, first to say that there was when in March and April last year, there was a very nervous time in Europe because there was a lot of pressure by certain political forces and business forces to sort of reduce the ambition of the Green Deal and sort of cut back on this. And at that moment, the European Commission, supported by a lot of member states and ministers and also civil society, pushed hard for the Green Deal to stay at the heart of the Corona response crisis. So it's worthwhile reiterating that, because we are standing now with 9 months after the beginning of the Corona crisis with a response which actually does try to keep the Green Deal at the heart of the architecture. Okay, so that's a key point. Now, with respect to your specific question on what Portugal can do, and what countries are doing with their national recovery and resilience plans, that's the formal term for the plans where all the money is going to go to respond to the recovery, and that's complementing to the EU budget. Now, what all countries have an opportunity to put different things in there. There's guidance, positive guidance, there's warnings and this and that, but ultimately the member states can decide to allocate a lot of money to very win-win initiatives which support the Green Deal and support the recovery. So, for example, in building restoration, in certain types of public transport, in renewable energies, where you can have high levels of jobs, high levels of green commitment. And so there's a win-win to build back better. But there's also a temptation for countries to simply use this to fund investments that they haven't got funding for, which may run against the interests of the Green Deal. So, for example, some fossil fuel related ones, or some private transport corridors. So I think it's open to the member states how they either support the Green Deal, support the green transition through the recovery funds, or not do that. And it's a big debate. I know that Portugal has been a little bit advanced compared to some countries, and in fact, Portugal is one of the few countries who've actually had some consultation with civil society to explore what's important. But most countries haven't done this, which is a real shame. So it's good that Portugal's done something. But so therefore, it's an opportunity to either keep going with the Green Deal or run against it. but it's one tool, it's one set of money. And I think, as I can't remember, as Jean-Marc said, it's a small amount of money, but critical leverage. So the other aspects of the Green Deal, which are often legislative or strategic, will still go on. There is a commitment under the National Recovery and Resilience Plans for 37% of the budget to be linked to the Green Deal. And under the wider EU budget, it's supposed to be sort of 40% for climate. Then, of course, the big question is what do you do with the other 73, another 60%? If you spend it on very bad agriculture, you can undermine all of the gains that you do with the good money. So it's an open question. It depends on the responsibility of each member state.
Yeah, that is a critical issue. Actually, in Portugal, we are kind of discussing, and also there is an important interpretation from Europe of what is a climate change supported investment. Because there are some things that might be included and some others that the Portuguese government already complained that, for instance, investments in wastewater treatment are not covered within the climate related package. But I would go to Marc Olivier, because there is, when you look at these times in terms of sustainability, we're really running into a lot of problems in many countries. And let me give you just an example from Portugal. By the end of the year, so a few weeks ago, we knew that one of the 2 oil refineries will be closed soon. And the 2 coal power plants of Portugal that Portugal have will close, one within a week and the other by November. And we're talking about hundreds of people that will lose their jobs to this green transition, combined with the pandemic, that are anticipating things like less diesel and gasoline being spent. So how can we combine a social economic view within this crisis and during the next 6 months? Because governments, I believe, all continue to talk about growth as the main key aspect. And as Patrick just said, we don't know where the other money besides the 37% or the 40% will go.
So, yeah, I mean, you raise very, very important points, right? In terms of who the potential winners and losers of green transitions could be, and how to prevent things that we've seen, for example, in France, where the Gilets jaunes, following an attempt to change taxation on fossil fuels that wasn't socially corrected, sparked huge social unrest. But before I get to your question, I do think it's important to realize that Europeans are roughly 7% of the global population, and we are responsible for 15% of global emissions, right? And also we have a huge historic responsibility in the buildup of the problem that we're facing, and that most of all the next generations are saddled up with. So that's really, really important. So we can't be self-pitiful or lenient with ourselves, because we have, as Europeans, a huge responsibility. Now, what's certain is that within Europe, there is also different levels of responsibility and a huge inequality. And actually, Oxfam published very recently, so last December, a report on carbon inequality. And so looking at emissions from the past 25 years, we see that there is in Europe, emissions from consumption, but there's a huge inequality between Europeans, and that inequality is growing. And so we've got 10% of the richest Europeans that are responsible for over a quarter of emissions, right? So all the Europeans will have to reduce their emissions, but the richest Europeans, much more than others, that's the target. And so I think that's where the Portuguese presidency is a really important presidency. And it's an opportunity because beyond the formal role of the presidency, which I said is very important but limited, the political role of the presidency is very important. And I think that your prime minister, in making the pitch for the presidency of Portugal, mentioned these two aspects: the social aspect and the green aspect. And so combining the two is really, really important. And as Oxfam, we think that it's through tackling the social inequalities that we can more quickly reach the climate goals. And that's where it comes to what John Mark referred to. So the implementation now of these European funds that will start flowing to member states, that's a key area where Portugal can serve, lead by example, basically. So what you will be doing in Portugal with this European money, how you can use it to resolve these social issues that you've just mentioned, but at the same time, build the new resilient future that is needed, is really, really important. Of course, you also refer to something that goes beyond, I think, what your Prime Minister has said in his public positions, is rethinking the concept of growth itself. And eventually we'll need to get to that, because to meet the reductions that we need to achieve, we will need to rethink the whole concept of growth and replace it by things like well-being. And that's something that maybe I'm not informed enough, but that's where I think you still have work on your governments to get them on board to this shift in paradigm.
Yeah, Jean-Marc, what is your vision on this? Through looking at actually at the circular economy as one of the key priorities in many countries in Europe overall. What opportunities? And we already have a question on about how the investment in green energy and green tech make up for job loss from coal and oil plants. So is, for instance, are there opportunities? And we have been looking at a lot of studies, including from the European Commission, saying that, the European Green Deal is more of an opportunity for jobs than we might think. But can we actually, do you believe that we can actually have this engagement of policies that will generate the jobs that we are losing in the old economy areas?
Sorry, you asked this question to me, right? Because it was cutting off a bit. Yeah, good. That's I think it's a key question. Nobody doubts that circular economy is the way forward. It makes common sense. It makes economic sense. It makes environmental sense. The problem here is that the roadmap, we know where we want to go, but how do we get there actually, and what needs to happen is clearer than it was 5 years ago, but it's still not crystal clear. Mainly because when we look at like kind of moving away from disposable solutions, and by disposable we can talk about fast consumer goods, but we could also talk about stuff that breaks too quickly. Could go from buildings to cars to white goods, etc. We know that if we set up selling the service more than selling products, there's more jobs involved in that. We know that there's also lots of technology possibilities also to develop on that. We know that repairing actually is more job intensive than recycling, and recycling is more job intensive than incineration or landfill. The question here is, if you take any market segment that you imagine and you say, okay, take packaging, we're going to move to the current quotas of less than 15% of reusable packaging to quotas of over 60%. What does it take to get there? What kind of infrastructure do we need? What kind of policies do we need? What kind of investment do we need? Because it's very different to invest in recycling plants and to invest into actually changing supply chains. And I think that that's a reflection that needs to happen also at the country level, because it's easy to say, yes, we should invest more in recycling. Yes, we should have longer lasting products. But how do we do that actually? I mean, that is a question that we're starting to answer market segment by market segment. But we know that the theory is there, but the details of that we need to work it out. And I think that the more that the Council discusses about this, the better.
And now let's jump to an issue that is critical. Let me just tell you that today Portugal started the discussion of a national climate law. So we had a session during the afternoon with 8 proposals from the different parties and members of the parliament. And on talking about not the national climate law, but European climate law, that is clearly a challenge for the Portuguese presidency. We have the European Council that basically looked at a reduction of at least 55% net emissions between 1990 and 2030. But the Parliament talked about 60% reduction for the same period, and also to include in the climate law at European level some other aspects like the way it is monitored by a committee of or even the discussion of besides climate neutrality by 2050. And but at least there is a disagreement here between the 60% from the Parliament no net and the at least minus 55% from the Council. So that, let me tell you that the Minister of Environment is very optimistic. He says that conversations are starting, and he would really like to finish the negotiations, preferably within just a couple of months. But you know, maximum would be like April or something. Do you think that it will be an easy task for the Portuguese presidency, and what outcome? And in this question, I would mostly direct it to Patrick, maybe also to Marco Olivier, and then we'll go to other topics.
Okay. No, thanks very much. I mean, it's a very good question. I think the German presidency fought really, really hard to be able to get the minus 55 net. They had an informal ministers meeting. They had various other meetings. They had opposition from four or five countries to the whole minus 55. And so it depends a little bit what Portugal's ambitions is. I mean, you could either run with the minus 55 net, as has been agreed now, and take the Parliament's 60% as simply a sort of a cajoling context to move forward. And then you can get an easy agreement. It won't be a sufficient agreement, but it's back to where we started about it's easy to get a light agreement, easier to get a light agreement than a proper one. It's worth underlining that the science suggests that you need minus 65%. So even the Parliament's position is weaker than we need. But two things. I think the one thing that's important that's at play is the issue of net, because this is net of the sort of carbon sequestered in sinks, whether it's soils and agriculture or forestry. And I think there is a room for the Portuguese government to bridge the gap between what's been agreed so far in the Council and the proposal of the Commission and the Parliament's position of having the nets having at least minus 55 with the sequestration issues on top of that. That would be a good win. even that won't be necessary for what we need to reach carbon neutrality. And then we just have to keep pushing in future presidencies, maybe having a review in 2025 to then push a higher target. And it does say at least, so I think it'll be really important to underline and safeguard the at least, so we can always over succeed, as certain countries have done with renewable energy targets. So I think it'll be possible. I hope that Portugal.
Let me actually introduce another topic, also on climate, which is the Portuguese presidency wants to give emphasis to the climate adaptation strategy that the Commission will present, and there is an informal environmental council that will take place in Portugal in April about the adaptation. And it will be probably in the council conclusions by June. Do you have any idea on how this dossier could be also important within the climate, the shape of the climate politics, and also in relation with the biodiversity topic?
Sure. No, I understand that the climate adaptation strategy will be one of the big priorities under the Portuguese presidency. That we've understood from the Perm Rep here that it's very keen to get an agreement. There's two or three big issues here. One is, of course, the issue of water scarcity, which is very strongly felt in Portugal. And I'm sure that'll be a core part of adaptation. But there's one big issue that we think is a bit of a solution and a synergy with biodiversity, and that's the issue of nature-based solutions. Because that's the thing which we think has to be at the core of the adaptation. If you look across Europe, there's lots of good examples of where you have sort of flood control links to with nature-based solutions, floodplains, salt plains, and so on, which are very important. You've got nature-based solutions for water sequestration and storage, which are also very important. So I suspect those will form a core role and offer a synergy between biodiversity and climate adaptation. And of course, as mentioned before, the minus 55% or even minus 60 is not enough. We will have to adapt. So we're not going to be able to mitigate enough to avoid adapting. So we need both. We need the strong mitigation and we need strong adaptation. And on the adaptation side, a key element will be looking as well as the interconnection between the climate change risks to various different sectors and peoples, whether it's coastal communities or whether it's agricultural communities, and look at the interplay between the changes of the climate, the changes of economic viability of various different activities, and the well-being of the citizens, and then to support that well-being. And then we'll have to be quite clever about what sort of tools can be there to ensure social justice around the adaptation, because some people will be hit harder than others.
Yeah, and I will actually pick that point to Marc Olivier. Oliver, during the last few weeks, in the big discussion in the European Council was the rule of law, and there are all these discussion on European solidarity, even the climate targets that we just discussed. There is this difference between some Eastern countries and the rest of Europe, and how hard it is for some of the countries to actually implement measures to become carbon neutral in the near future. So do you think that's, is there any maneuver, is there any margin for the Portuguese presidency to actually repair a little bit the environment, the political environment from December that was quite hard, and that also impacted some of the environmental policies that were being discussed during the council in December?
So, I mean, the two issues of the rule of law and the issue of climate were linked and should not have been linked, actually. So I think that's a first point to make. It was inappropriate to link the two, because They're really two very separate issues. And we shouldn't be bargaining, you know, our fundamental values against our climate policy. So that's the reality of what happened. But I think that as citizens, we should say that's unacceptable, right? It's really unacceptable. We shouldn't be compromising one against the other. I think the other link that was made, and which there is arguably more legitimate, is linking between climate ambition and funding issues, the budget, right? Where you know, Eastern member states or you know, member states that have a steeper change curve to meet the targets were, you know, pushing for a larger share of EU funds, and they got, you know, they got significant increases in that. So in that sense, I think that, you know, that they've been heard, and there is a next 7-year budget. There's a very big next generation EU, so new funds from borrowing on financial markets. So that issue, I think, you know, is settled now. Now is really the implementation. So I don't see that going forward as you know, hopefully these two issues should not come back. Now is the question, how do you implement and how do you make sure that the money is well spent, including by those member states, and goes to the right purposes? Maybe just going back to the previous question on the targets and the climate law. So the targets are really is a really important discussion, right? And as Patrick said, we should be aiming for at least 65% to do our share according to science at EU level. And actually, we should be doing more if you include equity, if you factor in the, you know, the financial capacity of the EU, the historical responsibility. We should be going beyond 65% by 2030. So again, I think we need to understand that you know, we should be lenient with ourselves. At the same time, the target discussion, we should not be blinded by it, because we can have very high targets, but then that could lead to the wrong type of things. You mentioned the issue of biodiversity. So other parts of EU legislation are not fit for purpose. And there is a big risk that increased investment will lead to the wrong type of things, including in the climate area, because these other parts of the EU legislation is not fit for purpose. So you mentioned that there's a refinery that will close in Portugal soon. What we've seen, for example, in several EU countries is that fossil fuel refineries have been converted to biorefineries, refining palm oil to produce biodiesel, using the subsidies and the mandates based on EU legislation in the Renewable Energy Directive, because we've got a wrong sustainability framework. And so that's an example of a climate policy supposed to help us achieve climate goals, but actually is driving destruction in tropical forests, pushing people off their lands. So I think it's very important for environmental organizations and parliamentarians and progressive governments to understand that the target is not the only issue we need to fight for at EU level. There's very, very important decisions coming up next year. So for example, the Renewable Energy Directive will be reviewed. The sustainability criteria for biomass, bioenergy needs to be reviewed, because very wrong things happen in the name of climate change because of those faults in EU policy and legislation.
Yeah, that is a problem that we also have in Portugal. You know, biomass is becoming more and more controversial, but I would like to jump now to some of the dossiers that are related with waste. There will be a revision of the waste shipment regulation during the Portuguese presidency. And also the revision of the batteries directive, and of course this is part of the what we would like to have as a cleanup of the industrial production and the implementation of a circular, decarbonized and zero pollution industry. And we also have the zero pollution ambition with the zero pollution action plan. But Jean-Marc, looking at waste, what are the main issues that will be discussed during the next few months, and how difficult are they? From the conversations we had with some experts from the within the Portuguese presidency team, they say that these are very complex dossiers, particularly the batteries directive. And maybe you can tell us something about these areas. And afterwards, we have already plenty of questions in Facebook, so I will jump to those. But Jean-Marc, for now, tell us everything about waste.
Yes, in 30 seconds. No, the issue with batteries and with achievement, it's part of the whole agenda of the circular economy, but it's also, it shows that the clear tendency that the EU kind of, and it's good that we start actually taking resources more seriously, and we want to stop using the rest of the world as a dumping ground for our waste. And I think that is good. And as you have said, there's the waste human regulation that is going to be revised in the coming months. It looks like, in this case, following the example of the Chinese, the EU is also going to ban, the Chinese ban the import, we're going to ban the exports. Still, under the Basel Convention, the exports of most of the waste for disposal were already banned. The problem here is not only a matter of having the right policies, it's a matter of enforcement. And I think that is one of the key things. So it's good that the EU is really considering a ban on exports, and we need to look at the details, and it's important that the Portuguese presidency looks into that. But it's important as well that, one, we watch what is happening with the waste then, because what is going to be happening if we're not exporting the waste is that it's going to be exported within European borders as a commodity. And that has had lots of bad impact, with actually waste from Western Europe being dumped or burned in open landfills in Bulgaria, in Poland, and other places.
Or coming from Italy to Portugal,
Like Italy to Portugal. So actually,
also here too, because we are quite inexpensive in terms of treatment of this solid waste, and those shipments stopped but took place for a while.
Indeed. So I would say that then we should push the Portuguese presidency to look to the internal borders of the EU. Yes, we have a single market, but that should not be an excuse for actually waste that cannot be recycled in Italy, cannot also be recycled in Portugal, and we should remain vigilant for that. We need more transparency for internal shipment in the EU. For batteries, very quickly, I think that the proposal on the table is good. We need to understand that we come from a very from a bad situation where the collection rates were ridiculous and the recycling rates were also not very good. So the proposal of the Commission to actually increase the collection and the recycling targets, all of that makes sense. I would just say that the targets that they have set are still very low, even for the current levels. So it is key to recycle nickel, lithium, cobalt, but we're talking about figures that are below 15% for one of the most important components of the economy of the future, that it's basically the basis for the electrification of our economy. So I think we need to be more ambitious on that, and it would be good if the Portuguese presidency would be able to push us and the industry in this direction.
Yeah, one of the questions that we got here was basically, if there is a carbon tax, should we also have a tax on materials like plastic or others? Do you want to comment on that, or before we go into other questions?
Very quickly, we've been very involved with the discussions on the plastic levy. And we were saying from the beginning that, well, it's good to have an European tax, but it would be a lot more efficient to actually tax carbon, because after all, 99% of the plastic out there is fossil fuel based. So, why do you want to tax the plastic waste, when you can actually tax carbon and go really upstream. That would be a lot more efficient and a lot easier to implement. But that's where we are today. But that, I guess, it also links to the conversation about trade agreements, and then we need to tax also at the border. And the products, of course, we should tax the carbon implications of actually importing carbon-intensive products produced outside the European Union. Otherwise, of course, we're going to be like disindustrializing our economies.
So now we go to fast answers from your side, and the ones that want to answer, go ahead. Let me give you some of the questions. One is, would changes in agriculture policy and moving to more vegetarian, vegan diets make a difference in Europe carbon footprint? Is this being actually part of Europe might do during the next 6 months? Just to give you a little bit more of the questions for you to select the ones you want to answer. There is one from Carlos. This last one was from Cole Angel. The other was another is from Carlos Fulgencio. He basically asks, will we have the Visegrad countries jeopardizing the European Green Deal in the mid-long term? And another from Susanna, and she basically says that in terms of the climate objectives, the higher the ambition, the higher the need for a transition, where production and consumption will be key and will have to be fundamentally different from what happens today. We will not get there with electric cars, but we will need a much deeper social and economic change. We are constantly reminded by their actions that most of decision makers are not there yet. How can we guarantee a qualitative jump towards this more just and sustainable future? 6 months won't do it. So, maybe each one of you can briefly comment these first questions. Patrick.
Okay, sure. Very quickly on vegetarianism and veganism. Yes, it will have an impact on the footprints. They are worth supporting, or flexitarianism. Whether it's actually within the agricultural policies is it's a bit thin. Then the common agricultural policy now is very weak. So I don't expect there to be a huge push in this direction. But it certainly has a footprint. It's certainly worth pushing. With respect to the Visegrad countries, they did obviously cause problems, or at least raise their voices very strongly with respect to the climate. But in the end, they're on board. So I think there's different ways of looking at it. At some level, they've got legitimate concerns. At other areas, they've probably exaggerated their concerns. But it's always important to look closely at each argument. And I think at the end of the day, I think it makes sense. The Green Deal also makes sense as a sort of a positive strategy, because as was mentioned before, there are additional jobs when it comes to restoration of buildings. There's additional jobs for energy efficiency and the circular economy. So in some ways, they shouldn't be cutting off their nose to spite their face. There's a lot of jobs in renewables. So I think there's a threat, and they'll use it as leverage, but I don't think at the end of the day they'll compromise it. With respect to electric cars, is not enough. Absolutely. I mean, public transport needs to be a core of it, mobility change, but then also a whole different vision as to what we actually need. So it's sufficiency rather than necessarily efficiency. And in that context, it's worthwhile taking one bigger step back and to say that often in these political contexts, people talk about politics and policy being the art of the possible. And they say we can't do more than this. But if we think about doing only what we think we can do now, we'll actually have a much bigger impossibility that we'll face in the future, like responding to 3-degree climate change. That's much more impossible than it is getting 65% agreement in 2030. So what we all need to do is to get out of the mindset of the impossibility of today, throw ourselves into the future and say, oh shit, if we don't do more, we'll have a much bigger impossibility in the future, and look again at what we consider possible now. and then we up our vision and our ambition. And I think that's a key thing, because otherwise we're stuck within small steps of the possible now, when we actually need to make a sort of a radical shift forward, without which we're not going to get there.
Mark or Jean-Marc? Mark, go ahead. Just need to put, turn your microphone on.
Yeah, sorry, I had an issue with my mouse. So yeah, I support everything that Patrick has said. I think the common agricultural policy is, really needs rethinking. And the question is, I'm not following this closely, but probably this is an area where Portugal should weigh in on the side of, withdrawing the current proposal and starting with something, that's coherent with the European Green Deal. Agriculture is a huge problem in all areas of environment and climate, and meat consumption also. Import of proteins for feed is the single largest driver of deforestation. So that's certainly an area where the Portuguese presidency should invest. Another area that I'd like to mention, which is really, really key to start really changing the structures of the system, beyond the food we eat, is the whole issue of taxation. And it's a very difficult area because it's still under unanimity rule. And there it would be really important for the Portuguese presidency to invest, to prepare, together with the Commission, the future proposal on the revision of the Energy Taxation Directive, which is absolutely unfit for purpose, and possibly also push to change the majority rule. So it's a bit technical, but there is a way to move away from majority rule in tax issues when there's an environmental or climate purpose, but it takes a unanimity decision to change the rules of the game. So that would be like a monumental contribution of Portugal if it were able to push to open the door, so to undo the lock, to go from from unanimity to qualified majority in taxation matters, and then we could start to have some real environmental taxation policies at European level. That would make a huge structural difference.
Jean-Marc, your turn.
Yeah, just to complement what has been said, I think that we are living unusual times, and it's clear that we need to challenge business as usual. The measures that are on the table and the institutional infrastructure we have on the table, like unanimity rule, for example, I think are one of the things that are keeping us from actually shifting gears and actually being able to face the challenges of the future. So 6 months is not enough, of course, to change the European Union. But if you want to show ambition, I think the Portuguese presidency should be looking at the blind spots, and there are many out there. Like it's been mentioned, only one, the part of the electric cars. It's true. What about resilient urbanism? Who is leading on that? Europe is still like probably the first in the world when it comes to like cities that are reinventing themselves in actually how do we move, how do we live, the quality of life, how do we produce food locally, shortening supply chains, and that's not being discussed probably in the presidency meetings. I would just say that I think it's important that if we live really in these challenging times, the presidency should also put in the agenda uncomfortable questions. The unanimity rule is one of them. The taxation debate is clearly another one, because someone will need to pay for all the debt we're going into today. And I hope this comes from taxation on corporate or the carbon, and this doesn't come from actually borrowing to the future market. So I think being brave and actually putting these issues in the agenda would be really good.
Okay, so we're very close to finish up this conversation, and I will give you some last words for what you think, where we where we will be within 6 months. But let me tell you that as Patrick actually said in the beginning, we are supposed, a presidency is supposed to be kind of neutral, but we actually have some feedback from the Minister of Environment and from the government that indeed a presidency can shape some of the dossiers, and that is our hope in some of the environmental fields that will be taken as relevant during this next 6 months. So your last words during the debate, Patrick, any last comment that you want to make?
Sure. I think that's just to build on that last point you made, Francisco, on having an ability to affect the agenda. I mean, we mentioned climate adaptation. I know that Portugal, the oceans issue is very important. So I suspect and hope that Portugal will push the blue part of the Green Deal, because I think there's a lot to be done there. And I think the Portuguese have a good basis to push on that. There is, and similarly, I understand that under the Portuguese, urban mobility issues are important. So it'll be good to see real progress on that. I mean, that's not, and complemented that with trans-European networks on transport, get a public transport link between more parts of Portugal, more parts of Spain, and really sort of start making a gear change there. And then just to end on one last point, we've mentioned Zero Pollution Action Plan, but the chemical strategy has been agreed before, and it's going to be on the council with the Portuguese presidency plate. And that's a hugely important dossier, because chemicals are one of these sort of time bomb issues for all of us. And I won't go into the details, we're running out, but it'd be really good for Portugal to make sure we have ambitious council conclusions on the chemical strategy.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, let me just add to the long list. I mean, there's one issue we haven't mentioned, but I just want to flag it to you in Portugal. The Commission is currently working on new legislation on human rights and environmental due diligence for companies as part of a broader sustainable corporate governance legislation. The idea is to change the way companies do business so that they look more at the long term, and also that they're responsible for the human rights and environmental impacts in their supply chain. That proposal will be coming towards the end of the Portuguese presidency, but I think Portugal behind the scenes would have a really important role to push the Commission to be as progressive as possible in its proposal. So that's an issue that environmental organizations in Portugal, they would want to watch in the coming 6 months.
Thank you, Mark. Jean-Marc?
Since we're on the hour, nothing to add. Thanks for the conversation.
Okay, so thank you very much. I know for you it's not 10 o'clock, it's 11 o'clock and 1 minute. I would like to thank you all in the name of Zero, and I know that this debate will continue during the next 6 months, and there will be a lot of conversations with the Portuguese environmental minister, between the different European federations, and between the Portuguese NGOs. And I really think we covered a lot of topics and a lot of ideas, and we fortunately answered some of the questions from the public. So good evening to all. I would say good night, and we'll probably talk again during the next 6 months to kind of evaluate what indeed will be done by the Portuguese presidency. Thank you all.
Obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Boa noite.